It is week 5, and that means Pittsburgh Steelers week for the Baltimore Ravens, as there is another AFC North matchup on the docket. We talk about if the Ravens can continue their momentum that they took from week 4 and bring it to week 5 against the Steelers. All come out next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I am your host, Kevin Ostreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here, making us your first listen each and every day. It's always free and available on all podcasting platforms, including over in video form on YouTube. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. We're our 5-day-a-week Ravens podcast, including some bonus content on the weekends when we do live streams and more. And we bring you the Ravens news, analysis, updates, and so much more. Whether you're watching in video form on YouTube, listening in audio form, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, thank you for tuning in. It's the same show, both audio and video, so you're not missing out either way. If you want to listen one day, watch another day, you can do that and not miss any of the content. You can also subscribe over on Subtext, where we have exclusive one-on-one text conversations and more exclusive content over there, such as mailbags and more. So tell a friend, tell a family member, we have their Ravens coverage over here. And today it's a crossover Thursday. So we'll be talking with Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers about Kenny Pickett, the Steelers offense, the surprisingly struggling Steelers defense, and this big week 5 matchup between the Ravens and the Steelers, and if they can continue the Ravens that week 4 momentum from Cleveland and bring it to week 5. So let's talk with Chris now about that Ravens and Steelers big rivalry AFC North matchup.
Kevin, how's it going, my man? We do this every year. It's always fun to talk football with you. The Ravens currently in first place in the division. I know when we did our crossover, or our big division crossover, some people were picking you to finish last, or picking your Ravens to finish last, and it seems like they are defying the odds.
Yeah, Chris, it feels like we talked about it in that big divisional preview. The AFC North has what potentially could be 4 playoff teams, I think, early through 1 month. We now see each of those teams have some questions, but Baltimore is on top of the North at 3-1, and I think they're feeling good, especially considering, which we'll get into, the Ravens are starting to get some players back from their very long laundry list of an injury report, which, it feels like I've been saying that every time we talk for the past 4 years. But I think the silver lining this time is that they're getting guys back. Not a lot of them were season ending. So going up against, this is actually their final AFC North road game for the entire season. They played Cincinnati on the road in week 2, Cleveland on the road in week 4. This will be Pittsburgh in week 5. After that, it's all AFC North home game. So if they can come out of that 3-0, it'd be a huge start to the season, especially in that division, which again, I think is going to be tough as the season goes on.
Sweeping AFC North road games would be huge for the Ravens. A great start to their season and put a lot of things behind them as far as getting those advantages in the tiebreakers. But for the Steelers right now, one of the biggest discussions is the injury to their starting quarterback, Kenny Pickett. He suffered a hit to his knee where he limped off the field late in the game against the Texans. There were some out there wondering if it was ACL, MCL, what it would be. Turned out it was just a bone bruise. Mike Tomlin said he'd have a chance to practice on Wednesday. He was a limited participant, and after practice, he sounded pretty confident about not only starting, but where he's trying to go right now with the Pittsburgh Steelers. But Kevin, last year, Kenny Pickett got his first taste of the Ravens rivalry, and he got knocked out of that game pretty early. Mitchell Trubisky having to come in through 3 interceptions. Of course, Kenny Pickett did come back, win in Baltimore with the game-winning touchdown pass to Najee Harris. This is going to be a huge week, though, because the Ravens, they have a tough front. They get after the quarterback, and we'll get into the pass rush element about this. But I think this is a huge turning point, or a huge, waypoint for the Steelers right now, is to see how Kenny Pickett plays. He did not play well before his injury against the Texans, and now he's playing the vaunted Ravens. A huge game for both teams right now.
Oh, absolutely. And for a guy like Kenny Pickett, who was trying to find something on the offensive side of the ball, Pittsburgh trying to find consistency there, I think one of the bigger shocks for the Ravens early in the season, Chris, is the fact that their secondary has actually been really good. This team is actually the best pass defense in the NFL right now when it comes to yards per attempt. And that is without having Marlon Humphrey for the entire season so far. They lost Marcus Williams in game 1 against the Houston Texans. Both those guys could come back this week. And we'll talk about the injuries here coming up, but it's been Brandon Stevens as their number one corner, who's played exceptionally well. Ronald Darby, who they signed late in the offseason. He's been great as an open field tackler and really good in coverage. Rocky Yassin making a couple plays. And then in the secondary, safety-wise, Kyle Hamilton has been great for them, being a versatile Swiss Army knife, coming off the edge, blitzing against the Colts. He had 3 sacks in the first half. The Colts had no answer for him. And then Geno Stone stepping up for Marcus Williams. So we'll see who the Ravens get back this weekend. But the Ravens right now, under Mike Macdonald, this defensive unit, not even the secondary, just them. It's been Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen, the 2 inside linebackers in that duo. On the defensive line, Justin Madubuike and Travis Jones, Broderick Washington, and Michael Pierce. The pass rush, which we'll get to, Jadeveon Clowney. They just signed Kyle Van Noy about almost a week ago. He comes in on Sunday after less than a week in the system, as a huge pass deflection, a couple of pressures. They're playing great football right now. And so for the Steelers coming into that, and the Ravens going to Pittsburgh to play that Steelers offense that, again, is trying to find that consistency, Kenny Pickett's going to have to figure stuff out quickly against that Ravens defense, because I think whenever they play right now, they smell that blood in the water and they go attack. They bring the pressure to the quarterback. And the thing with Mike Macdonald's defense is it is very intricate. And so for Kenny Pickett, he's going to have to find a rhythm early. To me, that's a key in this one for me.
It is the key. I think one thing with the Steelers, they want to start faster on offense. They started fast on offense in the preseason, and they have not done it in the regular season yet. They've been coming out with slow starts, 3-and-outs, turnovers, things that they have to erase in this game. And again, this is a tough team to do that against. Mike Tom with a lot of praise for the Ravens overall, but especially the defense and especially their linebackers. Roquan Smith, did he have 2 interceptions in that first game against Mitchell Trubisky? Because he was huge in that one. And then, they were a tough defense even in the game the Steelers won. But this to me is going to be big for both sides. Can the Steelers find a way to get their offense going against a team? Like you said, not only do they have the best numbers in net yards allowed per attempt in the passing game, they're also one of the best run defenses when it comes to limiting yards per attempt. They're 7th right now in yards per attempt allowed, with 3.8 yards per attempt. This is a defense that's been getting it done so far, and the Steelers offense, they have not shown any traction outside of a couple moments here and there against the Browns and the Raiders.
Yeah, I mean, this a number 1 pass defense and then number 7 in the run game, as you talked about there. Mm-hmm. And for this Pittsburgh offense, I mean, they're in the 20s in both passing offense and rushing offense right now. I think we saw a better performance from Najee Harris last week, and it gives you a little bit of encouragement. But the Steelers still gave up a bunch of points to the Texans, who, again, I think C.J. Stroud and DeMeco Ryans, that group's going to be good in the long run. I think they're a really solid team. But to me, part of this too is with the Ravens offense, the Steelers defense, again, in the 20s here, 26th in passing and 28th in rushing defense right now. The Ravens offense needed a bounce back game against the Browns in week 4 after, the play calling was not there in week 3 against the Colts. They had 4 straight fumbles on 4 straight drives, but we saw the field get opened up a little more. Lamar Jackson looked dialed in. And it's about, can the Ravens build off of that momentum? Lamar went 15 of 19, 186 yards. And the passing yard stats, I think, with Lamar, with the way this offense is built and the way it will run, he's never going to throw 50 times a game and for 500 yards a game every single time. He has the ability, though, to go out there and dice you up like he did in that Browns game. So for me, it's about, did that week 4 game against Cleveland provide them the momentum, or are they still trying to work things out? Because, again, this is a new offensive system under Todd Monken. They've brought in a couple new wide receivers with Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers and Nelson Aguilar. They're trying to find their own consistency on the offensive side of the ball. But I think after a sluggish start in that week 4 game, and obviously what we saw in week 3, the offense got it together. Now, that did lead to some second half play calling that was a little more conservative because, look, with Dorian Thompson-Robinson out there, who I do think has potential as a quarterback, it just was his first NFL start, thrown in the fire because Deshaun Watson said he couldn't play it even after being medically cleared. So Thompson-Robinson goes in, and it just wasn't his time. So the Ravens offense was a little more conservative, a little more 3-and-outs in that second half. But all I had to do was get out of that game and say, hey, let's just get out of here healthy, run the clock down. I think this Pittsburgh game will be a little more competitive than that because, I mean, let's face it, Chris, these games always are competitive, hard-fought games in this AFC North. But I'm excited for this one and excited to see what both teams can do.
Absolutely. We have a lot more to break down this matchup, especially with both teams' pass rushes being a huge factor in getting after those quarterbacks. We'll get into all that in a minute here on Crossover Thursday here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Chris Carter, Kevin Ostreicher, stick with us. We got a lot to discuss. But we also have a lot to discuss with our great sponsors at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is who's sponsored this show. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. They have it's the most fun that you can have when you're picking winners, and you can win up to 25 times your money this football season by just selecting 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place your entry for your chance to win money. Prize Picks is the new fun daily fantasy game that everyone needs to start playing right now. If you're big into fantasy sports, this is a way to get your daily fix by selecting individual player projections and making a simple decision whether they'll get more or less of a set number of stats, whether it's yards, sacks, touchdowns, whatever their fantasy stat is they're projected for, you can make money on. And it's simple. All you have to do is pick 2 to 6 players that you think you have a beat on for their day in fantasy. Choose whether they'll get more or less than a certain stat and make as many entries as you want in Prize Picks. You can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You can also take advantage of Prize Picks reboot policy, where entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For NFL games and college football, top 25 matchups, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with injury insurance. Prize Picks offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday, where every Tuesday Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value. And Prize Picks covers NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, college sports, and much more. Download the Prize Picks app today, or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and you'll use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Be sure to use the code LockedOnNFL, all capital letters, all one word, for a first deposit match up to $100. Back here on Crossover Thursday here in the Locked On Podcast Network, Chris Carter, Kevin Ostreicher, Locked On Steelers and Locked On Ravens coming at you right now. Kevin, we got to talk about all of the Ravens injuries here, because that plays a big factor into this. Looking at the injury report right now, it seems like the Ravens are actually getting a little bit healthier than what they've been dealing with. Rashad Bateman was a full practice. Odell Beckham, Justice Hill, Marlon Humphrey, all limited. Keaton Mitchell, Ronnie Stanley, Marcus Williams, all full practices. The guys who did not practice, Odafe Oweh, Darrell Worley, and Morgan Moses. What's the biggest noting points that you take out from that Wednesday practice report?
Yeah, I think it was a really good day for the Ravens because, as you kind of alluded to there, Chris, the Ravens have been dealing with all these injuries. And I think, as I mentioned, the silver lining has been, it hasn't been season ending for most of them. They lose J.K. Dobbins to the Achilles injury. It's really tough for him, and you hate to see him go down like that. But for the most part, it was these injuries that, you could come back in a couple weeks, maybe a month and a half. And so we saw Tyler Linderbaum, their center, return last week. Gus Edwards was in the protocol concussion-wise. I think he ended up playing, so it wasn't really a huge thing. But we're starting to see these guys get back where, week 2 against the Bengals, week 3 against the Colts, these injuries continued to pile up to the point where their whole inactives list were just starters who were injured. And it's unfortunately not something that Ravens fans are new to seeing. Like, it's been that way for the last couple of seasons. It's just the way it started off, with injury after injury after injury. And the fact that the Ravens have gone through that, and they're still going through it, but the fact that they've gone through that and are still 3-1, you could argue they should be 4-0, but they're not, because they did it to themselves. They lost that Colts game in the way they didn't do to sloppiness, but 2-0 in the AFC North, and they're continuing to get guys back. David Ajabo, there are some questions about whether he'll be able to return this season with knee and ankle injuries. But Odafe Oweh, I wouldn't anticipate him playing this week. Maybe he gets in a couple practices here and there. But just because these guys are back practicing, like Marlon Humphrey, for example, doesn't mean they're going to play. For example, last week, Marcus Williams, people were wondering if he was going to play again this season with the pec injury, which can be difficult sometimes depending on what the injury is. But Marcus Williams had to make a decision. He ended up foregoing the surgery and just rehabbing. And he ended up practicing in limited on Wednesday last week in 2 full practices, Friday and Thursday and Friday, but he didn't play in the Browns game. So I would anticipate maybe he comes back this week. But for Marlon, he might need a bit more ramp-up time because he's been out for so long. But just because they're back at practice doesn't mean they're actually going to play. But regardless, it was a good day for the Ravens, getting all those guys back. And Chris, I know the Steelers are a little beat up too. It's not just the Ravens who are dealing with a couple of injuries right now. And it's terrible how big of an impact injuries can have on the game as a whole.
I mean, it just seems it's a big thing, especially across the NFL right now. The Steelers dealing with their own injuries. Broderick Jones, their first round pick they traded up for at left tackle, is going to make his first start. Dan Moore Jr. already declared out by Mike Tomlin with a knee injury. Broderick Jones going to get his start in week 5 of his season. He hasn't started yet for the Steelers. He played significant amount of snaps. I thought he did okay in his first game against the Texans. We'll see how that continues there. Other guys that are on the lookout for, Pat Freiermuth is not expected to play in this game at tight end. That's another big blow to the Steelers offense, as he's been a big factor. It's his hamstring. He didn't practice Wednesday. Mike Tomlin said he was doubtful at the start of the week. Other guys that the Steelers are watching right now, DeMarvin Leal in concussion protocol. At the Steelers did not practice with them, but of course the protocol, as Mike Tomlin said, it's going to be their guide. We'll see if he turns available. And James Daniels, starting right guard for the Steelers, had a groin injury that held him out from the last game. Also didn't practice on Wednesday. Everyone's looking at that. Cole Holcomb also limited in practice with a back injury, but of course Kenny Pickett, the big note there as well. But looking at these situations, you see the Steelers, Dan Moore Jr., Chukwuma Okorafor, both your starting tackles did not practice. For the Ravens, you got Ronnie Stanley, who did practice in full, but Morgan Moses out. Those are two big situations because you have both teams' top offensive tackles on the injury report in weeks where both teams also are going to be bringing some pretty big name edge rushers to the game.
Yeah, and I think when you start to get into the biggest matchups to watch, pass rush versus offensive line for both sides is pretty big. And from the Baltimore side of things, it is going to be very important to watch who suits up and who doesn't on Sunday, because if Stanley's able to come back, awesome. You have your all-pro left tackle in there, and you can line him up against the Steelers pass rush. But if he isn't able to play, and Morgan Moses, who didn't practice on Wednesday, isn't able to go as well, then you're working with two backup tackles. Patrick McCary, who has played on the left side since Stanley's been out. Stanley got injured in week 1, but he's played really well, is that backup left tackle. Now, Daniel Faalele would be the right tackle, I'd assume, in this situation. He came in when Moses went down in week 4, and he's a big guy, can move people, but pass rushing, his pass sets are a little raw right now. I don't think he's fully ready to take on a full workload. Maybe for a game or two would be fine, but the hope is that the Moses injury won't hold him out for long, if at all, because if it does, and you have Daniel Faalele going up against the TJ Watts of the world and the Steelers pass rush, plus McCary in there, who struggled a little bit. Now, Myles Garrett was there, so of course you're going to struggle a little bit against him, but then you have TJ Watt, who you're playing this week. So No rest for that Ravens offensive line. It's going to be key, but they do have their interior intact, at least, with John Simpson, who won that job in the preseason, has played decently well for him so far. Linderbaum, who came back, as I talked about, and then Kevin Zeitler, who had a rough start to the season, but I think is starting to shape up a little bit and put better performances on the stat sheet.
One thing I'll say, too, the Steelers faced a lot of backup offensive linemen last week, and the Texans did a very good job neutralizing the edge rushers, while the interior pass rushers didn't really get home or really change much of the game against C.J. Stroud. That has to change this week. The Steelers, I think, know the pressure that's on them to make that kind of stuff happen. But I think, Kevin, one of the major storylines is going to be which pass rush can win more often in this game, and against different kinds of quarterbacks. The Steelers, they're used to Lamar Jackson. They know how to one pressure him, but also make sure that they're focusing on contain throughout their practices, so that they can make sure that he doesn't just kill them with his feet. Kenny Pickett, though, I'll say this, for most of Kenny Pickett's sacks that he's taken, he's also been the cause of them. There's been a lot of times, especially the one he got hurt on, where he's kind of tried to evade pressure that wasn't necessarily there yet, and he's run himself into trouble when his offensive line hasn't been really good this year. They've struggled at times for themselves, but there's been times where they've kind of held up and been doing their job, and he's kind of hurt their cause by putting them in tough situations. This might be a situation where if Kenny Pickett's biggest thing here is he can't hurt his offense with turnovers and by running himself into pressure situations, if the Steelers offensive line can hold up against this Ravens pass rush.
Yeah, and it's going to be really important for Baltimore to get pressure early and often on Kenny Pickett. Now, Baltimore's pass rush, I talked about it at FAOA. Obviously we said he didn't practice on Wednesday. That injury might be a little more serious than some of these other guys, so at this point, wouldn't anticipate him playing. We'll see how the injury report shakes out, though. Ajabo was put on IR, so he's not going to play. But Jadeveon Clowney has been incredible for the Ravens. When he was signed late in the offseason, there were questions. As an edge setter and as a run defender, he's been great, super consistent, one of the best in the league physicality-wise. But the concerns about the pass rush consistency, injuries, some leadership with how his whole thing in Cleveland went down last year, those are some of the concerns for a lot of people going in. But he has been disruptive all over the field. And actually, Marlon Humphrey called him Mr. Almost on his Victory Instagram Live, because he would have probably had, not even exaggerating, 5 or 6 sacks by now, maybe even 7, if he just wrapped up the quarterback and got the guy down when he got there, because he's been getting so much pressure. It's even the same thing in the run game where he has gotten guys behind the line, 4-yard losses, and the guy just escapes, and he's just been a little too slippery for him. But other than Clowney, Tavius Robinson, who they drafted in the 4th round this past draft, he's been getting a lot of run. They just signed Kyle Van Noy as well from free agency. The Ravens have been getting a lot of those guys late in free agency who have actually contributed, like Ronald Darby, Clowney, Van Noy. Duron Harmon, who was on their practice squad, just got signed by the Chicago Bears. So they're trying to find those guys, and it's worked out for him so far. And against maybe a Broderick Jones, his first start in the NFL, you line up Clowney against him, a very experienced pass rusher and someone who has a bit of physicality to his game. I think that's going to be key for the Ravens to get pressure early and often on Kenny Pickett and just speed up that clock a little bit to maybe force him into a couple of mistakes like we've seen the Steelers kind of have to deal with so far this season.
They have the Steelers pass rush has been the biggest factor to them to winning games. TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith literally both scored touchdowns against the Browns and were huge factors in keeping Deshaun Watson off task all night. Their pressures were forcing Jimmy Garoppolo to throw 3 interceptions in their matchup with the Raiders. And the last week that they lost, the Texans did everything they could to try to limit those guys, keep them out of positions to win. And that's been interesting. That's been a huge factor here. But one thing I think the Steelers, that Mike Tomlin did adjust this week. He talked about how they have to be more physical. They weren't physical. They were soft, even as Najee Harris addressed the team, saying that they were soft in that Texans game. They know that they cannot afford to play that way against the Ravens, which is always a physical game in the AFC North. We'll talk about those paths that both teams need to take to win this game. Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers, Kevin Ostreicher of Locked On Ravens here on Crossover Thursday. Stick with us. We still got a lot more to discuss in this huge matchup. But first, before we do any of that, I want to remind you that this show is sponsored by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in all of America. So get ready with all the NFL season with FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in the country. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed. No need to wait to see if your bet wins or loses. You're getting those $200 back when you sign up for FanDuel today. Plus, all new customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. These are the best deals you can get, which makes this the best time to join FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because the app is super easy to use and you can be on it on everything from spreads to player props and so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. This episode is also sponsored by BetterHelp Therapy Online. Life is full of twists and turns, and it's important to show up for yourself through all of them. I've faced plenty of times in my life where I've needed to shoulder a lot of burdens, but found my answers thanks to the help from good therapists. And that's where BetterHelp Online Therapy comes in. They assess your needs, and they can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done online, available to people worldwide. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your therapist. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit for you. That's why BetterHelp makes it easy and free to change therapists if needed. And they have a special offer for our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp.com/lockedon for 10% off your first month when you try BetterHelp Online Therapy. Back here on Crossover Thursday here in the Locked On Podcast Network, Chris Carter from Locked On Steelers, Kevin Ostreicher from Locked On Ravens. Kevin, let's talk about the paths to success that these two teams need to address if they're going to win this game. Has there been a singular identifiable thing that in the Ravens 3 win that they've done that kind of has clinched them their win, or have they been a team that's kind of been winning in different ways and is still figuring out what their best trait is right now?
Well, I think it's a little of both. I think when you talk about the defensive side of the ball, they know they're good. They know they have the guys. And this is year 2 for Mike McDonald. So I think some of the early growing pains last season that we saw were shored up by the end of the year, and he has continued that momentum. And they brought back most of the defense. Now obviously guys like Marcus Peters and Calais Campbell and Chuck Clark and Justin Houston aren't there, but I think they've filled those voids and shored up their depth in a lot better ways than they did last season. You can even go to the offensive side of the ball for that with the wide receivers, where we knew last year, Chris, if Rashad Bateman went down, with the way the room was constructed, they were in a bad spot because it was going to be Devin Duvernay and James Prochet and all these. They trusted their young guys, which the principle was not wrong, but it was another year of not giving Lamar Jackson, I think, the help that he needed and deserved at that position. But it didn't make sense for them to go out there and get a huge, big money wide receiver because the offense was never going to run through them under Greg Roman. So Bateman and Duvernay go down, and you're working with the corpse of Deshaun Jackson and the corpse of Sammy Watkins and like these veteran wide receivers that are going and not really doing a bunch. This year, though, is Zay Flowers, who they brought in, Odell they brought in, Nelson Aguilar. So now, even though Odell and Rashad Bateman both had to miss, Odell has missed 2 and Rashad Bateman's missed 1, you're confident because Zay Flowers has stepped up. Nelson Aguilar has stepped up, and that's been really good. So for the Ravens, in terms of winning in different ways, they've ran the ball effectively. They've also thrown it effectively, but to me, it's been the defense that's really stepped up for them. But Lamar being Lamar and feeling more comfortable and confident in this offense, I think his throws have been on point this year. The week 3 game against the Colts, no quarterback's going to play their best every single week. I think it was a rough game for him for a lot of different reasons. But to me, the thing that they can clean up is the sloppiness. Week 1, they had 13 penalties against the Houston Texans, which is just an absurd amount. And then week 2, they kind of shorted up a little bit. Week 3, they only had 1 penalty for 5 yards, but they fumbled 4 times on 4 straight possessions. Week 4 was the penalty situation, but they're still 3-1. I think they're winning with their defense, and they're winning with opening up the field and letting Lamar be a 3-level quarterback, letting those receivers be 3-level receivers, and running the ball effectively. I think that's what they've been doing to win.
The Steelers, their main way of winning is not the way that they need to be winning all season long. Their main way of winning has been their edges are getting pressures. They've hit on a couple big plays on offense, and they've been able to do that. But one thing that they've talked about, they don't have an identity yet on offense. And their identity was, as Mike Tomlin has talked about, and how Najee Harris seriously addressed after practice on Wednesday, is being physical, being the team that controls the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, especially on offense. And Najee Harris called his own team out. He was like, he called a player meeting. I believe it was on Monday that he called it right after the Texans game, and said, this is what they have to focus on this week. The Steelers added a padded practice on Wednesday where they got physical. They were, that was the practice they were gonna increase the intensity on. And I think that that's something that they're trying to use this Ravens game as a wake up call to both sides. Be like, hey, you haven't run the ball well consistently. You haven't stopped the run at all this year. You got to find a way to make this the week where you wake up. Otherwise, the Ravens are going to run all over you with Lamar Jackson, and you won't have any response to it with your offense if you're not able to buy your defense time, even when they do win. And so, to me, this game for the Steelers is going to be all about the trenches. It's going to be about how does this offensive line respond to that challenge? How does Najee Harris try to lead them in those moments? How can they take the pressure off Kenny Pickett having to play in a lot more 3rd and long situations where he's going to have to hold on to the ball, worry about that pass rush, and deal with that kind of pressure in the game. Keep him in favorable on schedule type of play calls, the way the Texans did for CJ Stroud, the way the Niners did for Brock Purdy. That's what the Steelers have to do, and a big part of this is the run game. And again, on the flip side, it's stopping the run, and it's not just it's Lamar Jackson. Knowing that he is a consistent threat with his legs, that he's very comfortable doing that. The Steelers have handled it well in years past. Well, they don't have Cam Hayward. They have a defensive line that's still kind of figuring out their pace with things. Their edge rushers are pretty set. TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, maybe the best 1-2 punch in all of football as far as edge rushing combos. They have backups in Marcus Golden and Nick Herbig, guys who have been pretty solid at their discipline, but they need this group to come together, and it could really come down to linebacker play with Cole Holcomb, Quan Alexander, Landon Roberts, and Mark Robinson, their primary 4 off-ball linebackers that they use. All 4 of those guys are I think are more suited to help stop the run, but they actually have to do it. They didn't do it that well last week. The only week that I think they even kind of like showed up in that department was against the Raiders. And if they don't do it in this week, it's going to cause a lot of problems. That's why I say for the Steelers, your best path to victory is that you do control the trenches. You get back to playing the kind of football that won you a lot of games last year. And then if you can do that this week, you set a strong tone, you get your bye week, and then you come back fresh out of the bye week looking to make sure that is part of your identity as a football team.
Yeah, and I think for the Ravens, there's been no question that the team that Lamar Jackson has struggled against over the course of his career, if you had to pick one, is the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, the stats here, it's crazy. And we talked about it a bit off air, Chris, but it's crazy. This is a division rival. You play them twice a year. Lamar's been starting now for 4+ years, and he's only played him 3 times as a starter in his career. He's 1-2, but the Pittsburgh defense has given him problems. He has a higher interception percentage than touchdown percentage, 59.1% completion percentage. The Steelers have had his number, and this was a huge conversation with the Chiefs for Lamar for a really long time because Lamar could never beat the Chiefs, and he finally beat them a couple of years ago. And while Lamar has beaten the Steelers, this defense is the one where Lamar has had a couple of issues being able to fully play to his potential. And you kind of talked about how they're familiar with playing Lamar, and it's only been 3 games. But in this game, it's going to be important to say, hey, you know what? Can Lamar finally get one on the Pittsburgh Steelers? Because even though he has won a game, it was not pretty for Lamar. So to me, it's going to be really important for the offense to just continue to find their identity. You talked about the Steelers not really having one yet. The Ravens under Todd Monken, first-year offensive coordinator, replacing Greg Roman, which was the right decision. They're still trying to work through some things, and they are 3-1. It's great that they are in that place, but I think Todd Monken has been a bit too conservative at some points. He's given the ball to Zay Flowers in weird situations like these reverses, which Zay's an electric player. You want to get the ball to him any way you can. But they're just trying to figure out, hey, how can we utilize these guys? What's the best way to utilize? Because not only is it a new system, but as I talked about, you're bringing in all these players that are new. And on top of that, there are injuries. So you're not really getting a consistent couple of weeks together on the field to fully figure it out. So to me, a big key is offense. And if the Ravens can just be more consistent in that way, put together a full 60 minutes. The closest thing we saw to that was week 2 against the Bengals. For the Ravens' sake, hopefully they can put it together in week 5 against Pittsburgh too. Major shout out to Chris for the Steelers insight. He always does a great job, and it's always super fun talking with him. Should be a good game. Hard fought AFC North division rivalry. And of course, we know the history of that Ravens and Steelers rivalry. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And be sure to subscribe. Video form, audio form. It is free. Also, be sure to subscribe over on Subtext for another way to support my work. Coming up tomorrow, I'll be rounding out the week, continuing to preview this Ravens and Steelers week 5 matchup and more. So be sure to stay tuned. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.